They never gave the children names, only numbers, stitched into their linens, burned into the edges of their wooden bowls. But what chilled the air of that place wasn't the silence. It was the absence of time. No birth dates, no calendars, no clocks, just an endless now. Every boy and girl who passed through the wrought iron gate of the St. Castulus Orphan House in 1851 Vienna entered a void, one designed not to care for the abandoned, but to unmake them.
You're not supposed to know this. You're not supposed to hear what they did in that building, how they rewrote identity, broke will, and erased lineage. But you're here now, and that means one thing. You were meant to wake up.
This isn't a ghost story. This is history rewritten by victors, filtered by priests, and hidden beneath layers of noble lies. Beneath the cobblestone streets of old Vienna, the elite ran experiments in silence, not on medicine or machinery, but on memory, obedience, and psychological control. The orphanage was their perfect lab. No families to ask questions, no pasts to reclaim. Only children with no legal anchor, no age, no origin, no history, who could be reshaped at will. If you think this was just an anomaly of the 1800s, you're already lost. This was a prototype. Those who visited the orphanage reported strange behaviors. Children whispering in languages no one remembered teaching them. Rows of empty-eyed boys who stood at attention, hands behind their backs, for hours in silence. Priests who didn't pray, only watched. And a ledger in the administrator's office, bound in goatskin, marked with only initials and dates of arrival. No birth dates, no place of origin. Just a record of when the child was erased and reborn into the system. Because the system wasn't broken, it was built this way. They weren't erasing identities to protect the children. They were severing the soul from the self, turning human beings into blank slates, into vessels, into something programmable. This was 1851's version of psychological warfare, and the darkest part? It didn't end there. What you're about to hear is dangerous, because it doesn't just expose a forgotten orphanage. It peels back the curtain on the machinery that still grinds beneath our world today. The one designed to keep you obedient, anonymous, and forgetful. This is not just a story. This is initiation. Ready to go deeper? They called it St. Castulus, but the man behind its founding was no saint. Baron Eduard von Schroeder, a minor noble with deep ties to the church and a private library of banned manuscripts, purchased the crumbling Jesuit monastery on the city's edge in 1848. Within 3 years, it had become something else entirely. Not a place of prayer, a place of programming. He claimed it would house the forgotten children of God. But no one ever saw those children again once the gates shut behind them. Official records were scant. No adoption files, no transfer notices, just a polite entry in a city ledger. Facility operational. Capacity 73. But we now know over 200 children passed through those doors between 1851 and 1855. Where did they go? Who claimed them? Why are there no graves, no birth certificates, no surviving relatives? It's as if the children were never meant to exist outside those walls, as if the entire point was to remove them from the fabric of history itself. And maybe that was the point. You see, in those days, Vienna was a city of masks. Behind the music halls and enlightenment salons, power moved in secret, through bloodlines, symbols, and hidden alliances. The Habsburgs knew this, the Vatican knew this, and Baron Schroeder? He didn't build an orphanage. He built a system of controlled forgetting. The erasure of personal origin wasn't a flaw. It was the foundation. Once you remove the idea of Where I come from, you can implant who I belong to. They began each child's life in the same way. Strip the name, the year, the family. Replace with uniform, number, scripture. Then came the instructional silence, weeks of isolation, broken only by whispered commands during the night. They taught them obedience not through pain, but disassociation. Not punishment, but abandonment. Not terror, but disorientation. When you have no tether to memory, you'll cling to the hand that feeds you, even if that hand belongs to your captor. Understand this. The science of psychological control didn't begin in laboratories. It began in quiet rooms where children sat alone, staring at blank walls, waiting for a voice to tell them who they were. This orphanage was an early blueprint for something far more insidious, something that still operates today, only with better branding and brighter lighting. The walls of St. Castulus have crumbled, but the system it tested is alive, and you were raised inside it. Still think this is just history? By the winter of 1852, the gates of St. Castulus no longer creaked, they groaned. Iron warped under snow and rot, but no repairmen were called, because no one outside ever entered. Not city inspectors, not medical officers, not clergy from the surrounding parishes. The orphanage had become a sovereign space, an island of shadows. Locals whispered that the children were being schooled in spirits, that strange candles burned through the night behind shuttered windows, but fear kept their questions to themselves, and the few who dared knock at the gate, priests, reporters, one retired soldier, never knocked twice. You want to know what they were doing inside? You're not supposed to. But we found records, not from the government, but from a forgotten stack of personal journals, hidden behind a false wall in an abandoned rectory. One entry, dated April 3rd, 1852, simply read, "The children do not cry, not when struck, not when isolated. They look through you. They have become mirrors." That phrase haunted me, because it's a clue, not just to what they endured, but to what they became. The erasure of their birth dates was just the first layer. The deeper objective was to erase emotional reflex. Imagine growing up with no personal past, no reference point for suffering, joy, or justice. You don't rebel, because you don't remember what rebellion is. You don't question, because you don't recall ever having a choice. And over time, even your instincts become pliable, like wax, waiting for the seal of authority. They trained the children in repetition drills, not military, not religious, but symbolic. Daily recitations of unfamiliar phrases. Order precedes self. The origin is the illusion. Memory is the first prison. These weren't affirmations, they were incantations. Mantras meant to unbind the mind from itself. To sever the natural, to open the psyche to programming. And it worked. One of the journals details a test conducted on a boy of 8. He was placed in a chamber lined with mirrors, given a doll, and asked a simple question. "Is this yours?" The boy replied, "Nothing belongs to me. I was never born." That is not indoctrination. That is transformation. You're starting to understand now, aren't you? This was never about care. It was about creation, the forging of an identity with no roots, no resistance, no reality. And while the candles of St. Castulus burned low, the blueprint they followed began to spread. They didn't hide it, they just renamed it. In 1853, a Viennese physician named Dr. Hannes Moser visited St. Castulus under the guise of a charity inspector. He never published what he saw, but 5 months later, he was committed to an asylum, incoherent, violent, scribbling crosses on the walls of his cell with his own fingernails. The only surviving page from his private diary, recovered decades later, contains just one phrase written again and again. "The children don't blink." 10 pages, same line, over and over. Now ask yourself, what kind of conditioning produces that? We tend to think of horror as blood, chains, or the shriek in the dark. But the true horror, the kind that leaves scars on history, comes in silence. It comes in repetition, in precision, in rituals designed not to wound the body, but to rewire the soul. By 1853, St. Castulus had become something far more than an orphanage. It was now a proving ground, an open secret among certain clerical and aristocratic circles, a place where those without pasts could be cultivated, then placed. Placed where? In seminaries, in guilds, in courts, in the very institutions tasked with shaping the minds and morals of society. Imagine that, men in robes, behind pulpits and tribunals, trained from childhood to have no memory of their origin, no concept of individual will, only obedience, only roles, only performance. You've felt the edges of this your entire life, haven't you? The teacher who never smiled, the judge who looked through you, the pastor who spoke with precision but no presence, the bureaucrat who seemed almost artificial. You've met them. You just didn't know what you were looking at. They were raised inside a lineage of institutional ghosts, men trained to forget and to make others forget. Echoes of St. Castulus walking among us. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a continuity. Because once they proved that identity could be erased, once they perfected obedience as a function of engineered amnesia, the model expanded. Not with orphans this time, but with the masses. Schools, prisons, asylums, workhouses, bureaucracies. Anywhere birth date and name mattered more than story and spirit. The children of St. Castulus were never meant to be saved. They were meant to be prototypes. And the prototype became policy. Are you beginning to see the design? There's something chilling about a building designed to look like salvation, but built for control. St. Castulus had a chapel, a bell tower, stained glass imported from Italy. Every Sunday, its children knelt in neat rows beneath an altar carved with angels. But no priest ever gave a sermon. No mass was performed. The sacraments were hollow, symbolic theater, meant only to reinforce a hierarchy. Kneel, obey, forget. The architecture itself was part of the training. Echoing silence, eyes from stone, symmetry without mercy, and symmetry is no accident. The floor plan of the orphanage followed a pattern known as the Kabbalistische Kreuz. It wasn't Catholic, it was older, esoteric, a layout used in medieval rituals of identity dissolution, a shape meant to guide souls through forgetting and rebirth, not in love, not in light, but in pure submission. They walked these halls daily. The geometry carved itself into their minds. Left became right. Yesterday became unreachable. Self became vapor. Every morning, the children were lined up and asked one question. Who were you before today? The only acceptable answer, I do not know. I do not ask. Ask yourself, what happens to a man who is never allowed to ask who he is? What do you become when your only orientation is downward? Eyes low, voice low, memory sealed like a vault you were punished for even noticing. We don't raise men like this by accident. We do it with ceremony. St. Castulus was one node in a much older web, one that stretches through monastic experiments, Enlightenment behavioral science and occult ritual. And what began in that cold stone orphanage soon migrated to modern institutions. Today, it's not a chapel, it's a cubicle. Not scripture, it's policy. Not a number on your bowl, but your social security ID, your employee tag, your login credentials. You've been cataloged, indexed, tracked, taught not to ask. Because a man who forgets where he came from can be told where to go. Do you see it now? The design didn't stop at St. Castulus. It metastasized. It scaled. The children were just the first. And if you're watching this, you already feel it. The unease, the recognition. That sense that you've lived your whole life inside a beautifully crafted lie. And once you see it, you can never go back. What if I told you the disappearance of the birth dates was never about destroying the past, but about owning the future? Because when you erase a child's beginning, you don't just take their story. You claim the right to write the rest. That's what St. Castulus did. It didn't just remove memory, it implanted direction. Every number stitched into those uniforms, every schedule carved into the stone walls was a claim of ownership, not of bodies, of destinies. The administrators called it Die Ordnung der Schatten, the Order of Shadows, a system of developmental sequences designed to shape behavior without the subject ever realizing they were being shaped. Each child was assigned a guiding figure, not a caregiver, but a silent observer who followed them for months, recording every movement, every hesitation, every moment of curiosity. Then, without warning, the child would be reassigned. New room, new name, new number, and they would be told,
"Your past was incorrect. This is who you are now."
Again and again, fragment after fragment, until they stopped resisting, until they stopped asking. This was the creation of what philosophers now call the interchangeable self, a human being trained to accept redefinition as normal, to welcome external correction as internal truth. A man who no longer says, "I am," but instead waits for others to tell him what to be.
Look around you. What do you see? Social media rewrites your identity every 6 months. Corporations demand you reinvent yourself every fiscal quarter. Governments tell you what you can be, what you cannot be, and when. And if you resist, you're labeled, diagnosed, re-educated. All for your own good, of course. But the template? That came from places like St. Castulus. Places where children were turned into vessels, where forgetting wasn't a consequence, it was the
Unrecovered on one report when unsigned, dated 1854, outlines a proposed expansion. Orphanages in Budapest, Prague, and Bavaria.
network of originless minds, ready for placement in spheres of influence.
Think about that. They weren't just creating obedient children. They were crafting future influencers. Judges, preachers, advisors. Men with clean slates and programmable wills. Men who could rise into power with no pesky allegiances to blood, heritage, or God. Just obedience to the design.
You were never meant to know this. But now that you do,
Would you like to meet the man who taught them how to forget? His name was never listed on official records. Not as headmaster, not as clergy, not even as staff. But his handwriting appears in the margins of every recovered journal from St. Castulus. Every ritual, every command, every phrase the children were taught, all annotated in the same ink, the same sharp angles, the same cruel precision. We believe his name was Father Albrecht Moser, though even that may be a pseudonym. What we do know is this: he didn't come from Vienna. He came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. Moser was reportedly a defrocked Jesuit, exiled under mysterious circumstances in the 1830s. He studied in Salamanca, Prague, and Rome, but not theology. He studied the arts of memory and forgetting. Manuscripts long suppressed by the church, techniques once used by inquisitors to extract confessions without torture, practices once called mystical, now labeled experimental psychology. And when the Baron opened the gates of St. Castulus, Moser arrived with one purpose: to test what could be erased and what might grow in the void. His core belief was chilling in its simplicity. Memory is a parasite. Remove it, and man becomes useful. He created a ritual called the reversal, conducted only at night, with one child at a time. The subject was stripped of clothing, placed in a circle of chalk symbols, and told to speak their name backwards, then forget it. The rite was repeated, slowly, with increasing sensory deprivation, until the child could no longer remember even the reversed name. Then, and only then, were they given a new identity. One letter, one number, one role. It wasn't cruelty, it was refinement. You've heard of brainwashing. This was something older, something more spiritual. It wasn't just about obedience, it was about spiritual vacancy, about removing not just ego, but essence. Because once the soul is hollowed out, the body becomes a vessel, and a vessel can be filled with anything, even darkness. A former groundskeeper, who fled in 1854 and later died in a monastery, left behind a crude sketch: a child standing in the ritual chamber, arms outstretched, eyes completely black. Beneath it he wrote, "They are no longer alone in there." Moser believed he was creating not servants, but hosts, not citizens, but instruments. The kind that could be planted anywhere and awakened when needed. And that's exactly what happened next. By late 1854, something shifted inside the walls of St. Castulus. The children stopped speaking altogether, not out of fear, but out of conditioning. Entire days would pass in complete silence, broken only by the tolling of a bell that no one outside the grounds could hear. Eyewitnesses reported columns of boys moving through the courtyard in perfect synchronization, heads tilted at the same angle, steps aligned to an invisible rhythm. One letter recovered from a nearby boarding school headmistress described it as, like watching a single organism, made of many bodies, one breath, one will. This was not education. This was orchestration. What Moser and Schroeder had built wasn't just an orphanage, it had become a symphony of control. And each child was an instrument, not taught to think, but to resonate. Respond, echo, obey. And once the tuning was complete, the dispersal began. In the spring of 1855, the orphanage quietly closed its doors. No records of relocation, no transfer of authority, just silence. The building was left to decay, its chapel desecrated, its ledgers burned. But not before we found a fragment. One line remained on a scorched page from the final day of operation. The placements have begun. The shadows will walk among them. And they did. Over the next 5 years, at least 19 new clergymen entered churches across Austria and Bavaria, all lacking documentation of seminary training. Several new legal clerks appeared in the courts of Vienna. A handful of unnamed aides were placed with baronial families and publishing houses. They appeared from nowhere, and they all shared one trait: no recorded birth date, no past. And it didn't stop there. Some believe this marked the beginning of a larger, hidden initiative, what later secret societies would call the Integration Protocol. A long-term plan to insert psychologically sculpted agents into every layer of influence: education, religion, law, and eventually, media. These weren't spies. They were mirrors. Men raised from infancy to reflect whatever ideology was handed to them, and to spread it without question, hesitation, or guilt. No trauma to process, no conscience to betray, no self to fracture. Just the program, walking in flesh. And you've seen them. You've worked beside them, voted for them, confessed to them, learned from them. Their power isn't in control. It's in invisibility. They're not above you. They're beside you. And they don't even know what they are. But you do now. Do you want to see what came after the orphanage? The closing of St. Castulus was never a surrender. It was an evolution, a necessary shedding of skin, the way a serpent grows larger by first leaving behind what no longer serves. But the experiment didn't die in those crumbling halls. It spread, quietly, strategically, through documents, through rituals, through bloodlines. You see, the real goal was never just the children. It was the formula. And once perfected, the formula was ready to be exported. Enter the Schwarzburg Directive. An internal memorandum circulated among select members of the Austrian Imperial Council in 1856. Stamped not for record, it outlined a proposal to develop systems of formative identity control for undesirable populations. That phrase, formative identity control, would later resurface under new names: educational standardization, behavioral correction, social reorientation. But make no mistake, it all began with birthdate erasure. The directive proposed a network of special institutions where subjects, not just children this time, would be placed in environments of controlled memory disruption. These facilities wouldn't wear the face of cruelty. They would masquerade as progress. Schools, clinics, reform centers, designed to break lineage, cultural inheritance, and any link to internal narrative. In short, to create citizens without anchors. Why? Because a man with no past is a man who cannot rebel. Because a people with no memory are a people who cannot resist. They began in rural districts. Institutions like Haus Eberfeld, Sanatorium Marzenloch, and the Society for Moral Recovery. You'll find little about them in public records. But private correspondences tell another story. Patients who arrived sane, but left like glass dolls. Entire families relocated, renamed, reprogrammed, generation after generation. The technique evolved. It went from forced silence to strategic redirection, from religious dogma to pseudoscientific diagnosis, from ritual to routine. And the results? An obedient population, compliant, anxious, ever questioning of self, never questioning of structure. Sound familiar? You were taught to believe control comes in shackles and guns. No, the deepest control comes in mirrors and paperwork, in identity documents, in your date of birth, in the calendar that tells you who you're allowed to be and when. The prototype worked, and now we live in its perfected descendants. Still think this is history. Still think this doesn't concern you. Tell me, when was the last time you chose who you were? Are you ready to look at the system that raised you? You think you remember your childhood, but memory is not truth. It's scaffolding. It's a structure built by others long before you knew you had a mind of your own. Your birth date? Assigned. Your name? Selected. Your language, your customs, your loyalties, none of them were chosen. They were downloaded, and you were trained to call that identity. This is the legacy of St. Castulus, because what began in that cold stone orphanage didn't just influence policies, it became a template for civilization, a quiet science of shaping the soul by shaping the narrative. If they could erase a child's origin and implant obedience, then why stop at the child? Why not rewrite an entire society? And so they did. Schools stopped teaching lineage and started teaching compliance. Language was sanitized. History was redacted. Cultural inheritance was reduced to parades, slogans, and bureaucratic holidays. You weren't given memory, you were given programming, a version of the world optimized not for truth, but for control. And here's the part no one wants to admit. We accepted it. We adapted. We even defended it. Because the system offers comfort in exchange for obedience. A quiet job, a clock to punch, a series of permissions disguised as freedom, a file with your name and date and number that tells the world who you are. And over time, you began to believe it. You began to need it. That's the genius of the model. The orphanage without walls. You can leave your house, your job, your town, but you never leave the identity they built for you. You carry it, defend it, die for it, even when it was never yours to begin with. Let's go deeper. Do you know why birth dates mattered so much to them? Because they marked the beginning of story, and story is power. If you own a man's origin, you own his myth. You shape his rise, his fall, his limits. You fix him in time. That's why every regime, every cult, every institution, from empires to corporations, fixates on record keeping, because if you control the record, you control reality. St. Castulus didn't just remove dates, it removed origins, and in their place, it implanted roles, archetypes, units, and now they've taught you to do it to yourself. But here's where everything shifts, because once you become aware of the program, you can begin to rewrite it, but only if you remember this next phrase, and I want you to comment it below twice to lock it in. I was not born, I was assigned. Now say it again. I was not born, I was assigned. This is how we begin to take it back. Now that the illusion has cracked, you'll start to notice the patterns, not just in your memories, but in the architecture of your very life. Repetition, surveillance, obedience disguised as opportunity. They say you chose your job, your schedule, your role in society. But did you, or were you steered? Because the methods refined inside the walls of St. Castulus, the stripping of origin, the crafting of identity by external force, didn't stay locked in some decaying 19th century asylum. They were studied, admired, replicated, first by monarchs, then by republics, and now by the faceless institutions you serve every day, without question. Look at your routine. Wake. Log in. Perform. Record. Consume. Forget. Where in that cycle is you? They don't need to beat obedience into you anymore. They've learned how to teach it with notifications, with deadlines, with soft punishments for nonconformity, a missed payment, a flagged account, a denied opportunity. You comply, not because you're weak, but because you've been trained since childhood to believe non-compliance is the same as disappearing. And in the world they built, it is. What do you think happens to a man without papers, without a birth certificate, without a login, a number, a file? He doesn't exist. And that's the power they discovered in Vienna, the ability to define existence by record, and therefore to erase existence by deleting that record. It's digital now, yes, but the principle remains unchanged. He who controls the narrative controls the soul. They no longer need orphanages with locked doors. They've built an open-air one. Cities designed not for freedom, but for monitorable behavior. Schools that train memorization, not inquiry. Media that numbs. Algorithms that reward predictability. Every one of these is a descendant of the order of shadows. And the final product? A man who asks for permission to become himself. Look at how many steps are required just to prove who you are. Licenses, identification, verification codes. Why? Because if you need permission to be, then you're no longer sovereign. You're owned. And the truth is, most men today are not lost. They're claimed. But if you've come this far, that means something in you is waking up. Not the version of you they filed and indexed, the one they couldn't touch, the one buried beneath layers of programming, the one who remembers without remembering. He's surfacing. Let's speak plainly now. You've spent your entire life inside a container, not made of walls, but of narrative. Your birth date was the first lock, your name the second. Each certificate, award, label, diagnosis, another shackle. But here's the truth they've buried beneath decades of smiling lies. None of it was you. It was a story written for you, not by you. A manual handed down generation after generation, telling you who you are, what to fear, what to chase, and what to obey. You weren't born into freedom. You were processed. Do you understand that? From your first breath, your energy was measured, tracked, redirected. You were taught to sit, to ask, to wait, to feel guilt when you resisted, and shame when you dreamed too boldly. You were taught that success meant following rules you didn't write, enforced by men you'll never meet, in service of goals you don't understand. And when you felt the pressure, the tightness in your chest, the dread of another Monday, the gnawing feeling that something is wrong, they told you that you were broken. No, you're not broken. You're awakening inside a structure designed to keep you asleep. The same structure they built in St. Castulus. Only now it wears modern clothes, the same rituals, the same goals. To fragment your will, to erase your origin, to replace story with status, myth with metric, fire with obedience. Look around. Notice how they reward predictability. Notice how risk is punished, how dissent is pathologized, how the wild man, the unfiled, the untraceable, the unbroken, is labeled dangerous. That man is dangerous because he cannot be owned. This is why they trained those children in Vienna to respond to symbols instead of thought, to obey the bell, not the conscience, to hear a command and act without reflection. That system has now scaled to billions. They've replaced the bell with a ping, the robe with a brand, the handler with an algorithm. But the result is the same. An obedient mind in a borrowed identity. Yet here you are, watching this, absorbing it, remembering something they tried to bury. That's not coincidence. That's resistance. You were not born to serve. You were born to see. To burn the script they wrote for you and forge one of your own. The old you, the programmed one, is beginning to fracture. And what steps through that crack next is something they fear. He is not tame. He does not ask. He does not beg. The version of you that is waking up now, the one clawing through layers of borrowed language and institutional shame, is not civil. He was buried, not broken, silenced, not erased. And what they didn't account for is that the more you suppress a man's origin, the more violently it returns. That is the force rising in you now. It's older than your schooling, older than your government, older than your name. It's the primal identity, not the one they logged in a registry, but the one that remembers itself, even when forgotten. It doesn't speak in complete sentences. It doesn't care about permission. It simply knows and acts. And they've spent centuries trying to kill him. Saint Castulus was just one battlefield in a war against that version of man, against the ungovernable self, against instinct, against sovereignty. They knew from the beginning, a man who remembers his myth cannot be controlled. So they rewrote myths, they disarmed gods, they replaced ancient symbols with corporate logos, they replaced initiation with debt, they replaced brotherhood with bureaucracy. But you've heard the whisper now. The same one those children must have heard in the dark. The whisper that says, you are not what they told you. You are what you were before they named you. Do you feel it? It's not just anger. It's not just confusion. It's recognition. That's what made St. Castulus so effective. They didn't just isolate the children. They isolated them from themselves. They trained them to fear their own impulses, to ask before moving, to forget joy, to numb rage. And over time, those blank slates could be rewritten into whatever the order required. Servant, agent, preacher, pawn. But a few resisted. A few remembered. There's one story, buried in a letter smuggled from the orphanage, of a boy who refused the final ritual. He bit his own tongue and spat blood on the chalk circle. He screamed his real name over and over until his voice cracked. That night the ritual was canceled. He was never seen again. They feared that boy. Because he shattered the illusion. He showed the others that remembering was possible. That boy still exists. He lives in every man who suddenly feels the weight of his own story pressing against his skin like armor. You've carried him your whole life, and now he's awake. He doesn't speak in words. He speaks in decisions. In the moment you hesitate and choose forward. In the moment you're told to stay silent and you speak. In the split second where your conditioning flinches and your instinct doesn't, that's the first sign he's returned. Not a rebellion of fists, but of remembrance. Because what the architects of control always feared most wasn't violence. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that burns through propaganda like fire through dry parchment. The kind that makes men impossible to herd, impossible to guilt, impossible to program. They saw it in the children of St. Castulus. Those who resisted weren't louder. They were clearer, unshakable, anchored in something the rituals couldn't touch. That's why Moser intensified the erasure process, why Schroeder pushed for more isolation, because clarity is contagious. One child remembering who he truly was could break the spell for all the others. And now, it's your turn. Ask yourself, when did you stop trusting your own voice? Was it in a classroom, when questioning authority got you punished? Was it at work, when honesty meant being passed over? Was it in church, when you were told your instincts were sin? Was it with your father when he taught you to be quiet, not powerful? Wherever it was, that's the doorway. And the man waking up inside you now is standing in front of it. Understand this. You are not broken. You are layered, covered in story after story that isn't yours, bound in rituals of guilt, shame, and duty that were never designed to empower you, only to contain you. And now, those bindings are rotting, because truth erodes lies like acid, slowly, then all at once. And your truth? It has nothing to do with paperwork, with timelines, with qualifications. It's this. You were never meant to fit. You were meant to burn. You were never meant to obey. You were meant to remember. This is why you've always felt the edge of something unseen, the pressure in your chest when you enter a sterile room, the unease around men who speak in titles but have no weight, the silence in you when the world screams for applause. You're not broken. You're ancient. You're not late. You're returning. And what happens next is the beginning of war, the kind they can't fight with rules. Every system of control fears the same thing, a man who does not need it. That man is not violent by nature, but when threatened, he is capable of unspeakable force, not out of impulse, but out of alignment, because he does not act to survive. He acts because he remembers, and memory, in its purest form, is not data, it is power. Rituals, bloodlines, ancient oaths, all of them are built on remembering who you are and what you were made for. That is what the architects of St. Castulus sought to destroy. Ancestral alignment, the spiritual chain of men who came before you, the ones whose eyes you carry, whose mistakes you inherit, whose unfinished wars live in your bones. If they could sever that connection, they could program you into a blank compliance shadow of what you were meant to be. And they nearly succeeded. They turned story into noise, replaced elders with experts, made initiation into manhood a joke. They gave you screens instead of scars, policies instead of wisdom, therapy instead of initiation. And now, generations of men sit in silence, medicated, isolated, overinformed, and underawakened. But there's a fracture now, a rupture in the dam. That's what you're feeling. It isn't anxiety. It's the sound of the old you dying, and the real you being born. You're not just hearing these words. You're remembering them, because your body, your gut, your instinct, they already knew. They've always known. You felt it when something didn't add up. When the job, the church, the relationship, the structure, all of it felt scripted. False. Like a stage set, built to keep you facing the wrong direction. And now, you're turning around. You're facing what they trained you not to see. The door. The one out. The one through. But to walk through it, you must let the old self burn. Not with fire, with choice. You must reject the assigned narrative. You must reject being a number, a function, a role. You must stop asking to be seen and start seeing. You were not made to be digestible. You were not made to be managed. You were made to be ungovernable in the name of something older than law. Truth. And the truth is this: if you awaken, others will too. And if enough of us awaken, they lose everything. There's a moment in every man's life, often quiet, unremarkable, even invisible to others, when the programming starts to flicker. It might happen in traffic, at work, in church. A moment where something is said, and your mind doesn't accept it the way it used to. It resists. Not out of rebellion, but out of recognition. You feel a tightness in your gut. You feel the words hit wrong. You feel the ancient part of you, the part they tried to drown, stir. That moment is the crack in the wall. And once it forms, the entire edifice begins to crumble. St. Castulus was built to prevent that crack. Every ritual, every erasure, every replacement of name and origin was a stone in the wall meant to contain that moment of awakening. And yet, even there cracks appeared. One child would a real name. Another would hum an old tune. A third would draw the symbol of his village in the dirt behind the dormitory. They couldn't kill the origin. They could only bury it. But what is buried is not gone. It is growing. That's what they never understood. You cannot destroy a man's fire. You can only dam the current, but pressure builds, and when it breaks, when a single man reclaims what was taken, the entire lineage shifts. That's what's happening now, across the world. Not just men waking up, lineages waking up. Men are breaking generational assignments. The quiet rage you feel, that's not yours alone. That's the voice of your blood, your ancestors, your mythos, clawing upward through you, demanding remembrance. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear the question they've been screaming for centuries. When will you stop playing their role and start living our story? Not the story of a consumer, not the story of a worker, not the story of a man who dies quietly with his dreams unspoken, but the story of a remembered king, a builder, a fire starter, a man with a spine made of oath and eyes that cut through illusion. That story terrifies them, because one man living it authentically is more dangerous than 1,000 marching in line. That's why they erased the birth dates. That's why they gave you one. It wasn't to record your beginning. It was to assign you a limit, and you were never meant to have one. A date is not just a number. It is a marker, a stamp of inclusion. It places you on their timeline, inside their structure, under their rule. Your birth date isn't a celebration. It's a declaration. You belong to us, now. From the moment it's inked on a certificate, you are no longer sovereign. You are cataloged, traceable, accountable to a system you never agreed to serve. And that was the genius of St. Castulus. By removing birth dates, they didn't make the children lost. They made them unclaimed, unregistered souls. Neither state property nor church dependence. That terrified the outside world because it exposed the illusion. Identity in their system isn't about who you are. It's about who they say you are. And yet when those children were stripped of time, something ancient emerged. They began to dream in symbols they were never taught. Some spoke languages no one could trace. One carved a spiral into stone, over and over, an image later discovered on prehistoric cave walls in Sardinia and Siberia. The removal of time didn't break them. It unlocked them. Because when you are no longer bound by the false beginning they gave you, something older comes forward. That's what's trying to surface in you right now. Look at your life. You've worn the masks: student, employee, husband, son. But where, in all of that, is the originless you? The one who existed before the dates, the grades, the paperwork. The one who didn't need validation to feel real. That man is dangerous. Because he can't be filed, can't be tracked, can't be shamed or caged. And he remembers what they hope you never recall. Time is a prison when you didn't build the clock. This is why their systems obsess over age, over milestones, over life stages. You must marry by this age, achieve by that one, retire before another. It's all choreography, dance steps for domesticated souls. But you're no longer dancing. You're breaking rhythm, stepping off the stage, walking backward into something far more real than progress. Into origin. Not a point on their timeline, but a fire that doesn't age. You feel it now, don't you? That trembling beneath your skin isn't fear. It's the shedding of a name you never chose. And what takes its place will not be welcome in their world. Matches don't burn because they're struck. They burn because they're ready. Friction only reveals what was always waiting beneath the surface. And you, watching this, breathing differently now, remembering what they told you to forget. You're ready. Because the program only holds power over the man who needs it. And that's the final tether they anchored in you. Need. Not real need. Not food. Not shelter. Not blood. Validation. Approval. Inclusion. They made you believe your existence depended on their recognition, and that is the lie we burn now. St. Castulus proved the terrifying opposite. A man without validation becomes unstoppable. When you are no longer asking to be seen, you see. When you are no longer seeking permission, you act. When you are no longer begging for safety, you become dangerous. The orphanage didn't destroy the children. It removed the veil. It stripped the conditioning faster than society normally does. And what emerged in those who survived wasn't emptiness. It was primal will. You don't need centuries of culture to know who you are. You need silence, solitude, and fire. But that fire makes you a threat. That's why they distract you. With screens, with outrage, with 1,000 micro rewards for compliance. They need your attention pointed away from the origin, away from the moment you realize you never needed them. And they fear the day you remember your own authority. Because once you do, you don't protest, you don't plead, you walk away. And no institution built on fear can survive a man who walks without it. This is why the program doesn't focus on controlling the body anymore. It focuses on controlling the mindset. They don't beat the rebellion out of you. They diagnose it, pathologize it, medicate it, smother it with narratives. You're just tired, you're burned out, you need rest. No, you need war. Not against others, against the parasite within, the voice that tells you to stay quiet, the fear that says not now, the hesitation they implanted when you were too young to fight back. Burn it. Burn the hesitation. Burn the birth date. Burn the idea that you need their stage to be significant. You were never meant to wait your turn. You were meant to take your place, and that place exists outside the file, outside the role, outside the timeline. They built this world to contain fire, but you were built to spread it. Fire doesn't ask if it's allowed. It moves, it consumes, it transforms. And that's why they fear men like you. Men who have stopped waiting to be defined. Because the moment you stop seeking definition, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one variable every control system is built to eliminate. St. Castulus wasn't about education. It was about simulation. Simulating the conditions under which identity could be broken and replaced. They ran drills in obedience. But beneath the surface, it was a lab for spiritual sterilization, the removal of unpredictability from the human soul. Now think about your world. Every platform you use, every form you fill out, every service you sign up for, asks the same question. Tell us who you are. And you oblige, every time. Because you've been trained to believe that if you don't provide a profile, a label, a status, you'll be invisible. But what if that's the trap? What if invisibility to them is the beginning of sovereignty? What if the man who refuses to be profiled is the only one who can no longer be programmed? They made birthdates sacred so they could turn time into a leash. They made social contracts divine so they could make obedience feel like virtue. But here's the raw truth they've buried under centuries of carefully choreographed shame. You don't owe them a damn thing. Not your story, not your allegiance, not your name, and certainly not your soul. You were born for something older than the schedule, something deeper than the system. You were born for weight,
for consequence, for myth. And they gave you comfort in exchange for that weight. Comfort laced with surveillance, with sedation, with the subtle death of your own voice. But that voice is coming back. And you can feel it now, can't you? That low hum in your chest, that sense that your life is about to ignite. Not because someone gave you permission, but because you remembered you never needed it. This is the break, the irreversible line. After this, you don't go back. You don't unknow. You don't unsee. The programming doesn't work the same once you've looked it in the eye and laughed. Because men like you don't return to the cage. Men like you melt the bars. And the next move? We're going to expose how the orphanage model became the blueprint for modern education, employment, and digital life. You're going to recognize yourself in places you thought were safe. Are you ready? Take a breath and look around. Not with your eyes, with your awareness. The room you're in, the routine you follow, the life you think is yours. Now ask yourself, quietly and honestly, was any of this built for my awakening? Or was it designed for your containment? You already know the answer. Every institution you've ever passed through was built on the same blueprint refined inside St. Castulus. Obedience through erasure. The school system, a modern orphanage, not in brick and shadow, but in spirit. A place where the wildness of boys is pathologized, where questions are punished, where hierarchy is implanted before thought has even taken root. You sat in rows. You were told what to memorize. You were rewarded for repeating what others said, not for speaking from within. That wasn't education. That was domestication. A ritual of forgetting, of defanging. And the moment you left that system, they handed you a new leash, employment, the job, the modern altar of worth, a place where your value is measured by hours submitted, tasks completed, compliance demonstrated, where asking why makes you a liability, where initiative outside the box is not innovation, but insubordination. And just like the orphanage, there's always a record, a file, a performance review. Your assigned identity, logged and monitored. And if that doesn't mold you completely, they hand you the third leash, digital life, the most sophisticated version yet. Now, you're not just tracked, you track yourself. Every click, every post, every swipe. You curate your cage and call it expression. You wear your algorithm like a skin and wonder why you feel hollow.
because you were taught that safety lies in visibility. But the truth is, visibility is just surveillance with lipstick on. Look closer. You've become a willing participant in your own containment. Not because you're weak, but because you were taught that compliance is peace, that success is structure, that manhood is permission. It's not. Manhood, true manhood, is remembering who you were before they trained you to forget. It's reclaiming the parts of yourself that never fit their mold. It's burning the script and writing your own in blood and silence and fire. You are not an employee, not a user, not a demographic. You are the origin, unassigned, unfiled, untamed. But they won't let that stand. The moment a man begins to remember, truly remember, the system doesn't ignore him. It responds. Swiftly, subtly, with smiles and handshakes at first, reassurances, diversions, promotions even, anything to keep him inside the pattern, because a man who awakens is a mirror, and that reflection terrifies them. The children of St. Castulus who resisted weren't punished publicly. That would risk sparking resistance in others. Instead, they were disappeared, quietly reassigned, removed from group rituals, whispered about in passing tones. He's not well. He failed the process. He's being held. Labels were the first weapons, not chains. Now look at your own world. When you begin to step outside their narrative, what happens? They call it burnout, depression, non-compliance. They offer you solutions, therapy, medication, wellness programs. They reframe your awakening as malfunction. Because in their eyes, a man who begins to remember his own origin is sick. But you are not sick. You are shedding. And shedding is violent. They will tell you you're unstable, that your questions are conspiratorial, that your refusal to conform is immature, dangerous, unprofessional. But that's the language of fear. You are threatening their illusion, and illusions defend themselves not with force, but with narrative. They will try to isolate you, make you feel alone in your clarity. But you are not alone. There is a brotherhood of men scattered across the world, walking through the same fire. You've seen it. In the eyes of strangers who don't flinch, in voices that speak without apology, in men who carry something heavy and invisible, something unfiled. You recognize them because they, too, have rejected the assignment. This isn't a trend. This isn't rebellion. This is return to source, to origin, to the man beneath the programming. And when enough of us return, the system cannot survive, because it requires mass agreement. It requires compliance through consensus. And when that consensus cracks, the machine starts to stall. That's why they move faster now. Why new rules are rolled out weekly. Why every structure feels like it's closing in. Because they feel the shift, the fire, the rising. You've lit yours. And what's coming next? They will try to drown it. They will push back harder than before. Pressure is not the enemy of the awakened man. It is the final confirmation that he is no longer sleeping. Every man who begins to peel away the false layers of his identity will feel it. Tightening at work, tension in relationships, the silent withdrawal of friends who once smiled when he played small. This isn't coincidence. It's design. Pressure is the system's final plea. Come back. Don't change. Don't evolve. Stay in the role. But roles are for actors, and you were never meant to perform. You were meant to command. Understand this. When you were quiet, compliant, forgettable, you were invisible to the machine. But the moment you remembered who you are, you became visible in the way they fear most, not as a threat with fists, as a disruption with presence. A signal that the programming doesn't work anymore. And when a system built on silent consensus encounters presence, it trembles. St. Castulus didn't just disappear those who resisted. They tried to disprove them, gaslight them. One boy who screamed his real name during ritual was locked in a mirror room for 3 days. No light, no sound, just his own reflection. When he was pulled out, they asked, "Who are you?" He whispered, "I am no one." They marked that as a success, but it wasn't. Years later, that same boy, now a nameless servant in the court of a Bavarian duke, vanished without trace. On the wall of his room, scratched with a dull spoon, were 5 words, "I remember. So I left." That's what pressure is really about. Not to break you, but to tempt you to break yourself. To abandon your ascent. To return to the container where it was warm, predictable, numb. But you're past that now. You've crossed the event horizon. You've seen too much, felt too much, recalled things you weren't supposed to. Every shiver in your spine, every dream that left you breathless, that was memory trying to surface, not just yours. Your bloodlines, your myths. You are not a man under pressure. You are a man compressing the system around him. Your awakening is not passive. It has weight, gravity. It pulls at reality itself. That's why they fight it. That's why it hurts. But you know the deeper truth now. Pain is proof of power. Pain is the most misunderstood force in the modern world. They told you it was a sign of failure, a signal to retreat, an alert that something is wrong. But that's a lie, whispered by those who've never dared to cross their own thresholds. In truth, pain is the compass of transformation. It does not come to destroy. It comes to awaken. Every system of suppression trains you to fear pain. Emotional, social, physical. Because when you fear pain, you'll do anything to avoid it. You'll conform. You'll stay quiet. You'll trade freedom for comfort. You'll stay asleep. And that's exactly what they want. St. Castulus weaponized silence, but it was the children who felt the most, the ones who couldn't suppress their rage, their grief, their memory, who cracked the programming first. One girl, only known as Subject V39, refused to kneel during the morning prayer ritual. Not once, but every day. They removed her meals, her blanket, her voice. They wrote in the ledger, emotionally unstable, dangerous to cohesion. But years later, a priest who left the order would confess on his deathbed, "She made me doubt the ritual. I watched her bleed from hunger and still not bow." Pain did not destroy her. It converted her. That is the truth they'll never teach in schools, never preach from pulpits, never permit in polite society. That pain, when chosen, becomes power. When embraced, it becomes a weapon. When endured in alignment, it becomes clarity. Thoughtful. Look at your own life. The moments that shaped you weren't painless. They were crucibles, breakups, losses, death, humiliation. And still, you rose. Not in spite of pain, through it. Because pain strips away the unnecessary. It reveals. It sharpens. And now that you're remembering who you are, the pain isn't a warning, it's an initiation. The discomfort in your job, the alienation from your peers, the unrest in your own mind. These aren't failures. These are signs that your old identity is burning, that your false assignments are collapsing, that your origin, your real origin, is resurfacing through the cracks, and that means you are no longer manageable. You are becoming ungovernable. The last ritual isn't in a cathedral. It isn't performed in robes or under candlelight. It happens every day, in silence, in repetition, in surrender. It's called compliance, and it's performed by billions. You wake, you dress, you clock in, you nod. You smile when you don't want to. You suppress the truth that rises in your throat. You sign the forms. You pay the fees. You scroll past your own instinct. You obey, not because you're weak, but because the system taught you that obedience is virtue. It isn't. Obedience is currency, and you've been spending it every day to buy a false peace, the kind that numbs you just enough to forget what it cost. But here's the deeper horror. This ritual has a sacred object, a symbol of submission you carry with pride, your name, the one they gave you, the one tied to the birth date, to the file, to the number, the name you write on forms, the name you whisper when no one's watching. That name is your assignment. And until you challenge it, you are still kneeling in the chapel of the system. This was the final layer perfected at St. Castulus, the illusion of autonomy within the bounds of the name. Each child was renamed upon entry, assigned a letter and a virtue. T13, humility. D47, silence. Names designed not to reflect self, but to impose identity. Even their dreams over time became infected with these new codes. One boy during sleep studies was recorded repeating, "I am not a person. I am the purpose." He was 9. Now look in the mirror. Are you living your purpose? Or are you still living the assignment? It's time to shatter the ritual. Not with rebellion, with remembrance. You must reclaim your name, or burn it, because you cannot build truth on a foundation of fiction. You were not named. You were spoken into existence. And somewhere along the way, they replaced that original sound with a barcode. You want to awaken? Then start there. Strip it down. Write the name that belongs to you. Speak it aloud. Not for them, for you. Because from this point forward, every time you say a name, it must mean something. It must summon something. To name yourself is the most defiant act a man can commit in a world built on assignments. It is a spiritual rebellion, a declaration that no system, no priest, no parent, no paperwork owns the right to define you. Because the first lie they ever told you was your name. It was whispered to you in softness, wrapped in love. But beneath that surface was the contract. You are this. You will answer to this. You will build your life on this sound. And without ever consenting, you did. But names are spells, ancient ones. And when a spell is spoken enough times, it becomes a cage. That's what St. Castulus understood. That's what made it more than an orphanage. It was a monastery of manufactured identity. Names were not given based on history or love. They were assigned based on function. A boy who showed initiative was renamed Order. A girl with creative leanings became Restraint. Every time they were called, every time they responded, they reinforced the altar of programming. Now consider your own name. Who gave it to you? What did it mean to them? What did it shape in you? Has it served you? Or has it served the version of you they wanted you to become? This isn't about sentiment. This is about alignment. In ancient tribes, a man was named 3 times. Once by birth, once by ordeal, and once by himself. The first was innocence. The second was earned. The third was sacred. You've been living under the first, maybe the second. But now, it's time for the third. This is why naming yourself was banned. Why emperors and popes feared it. Because the moment a man names himself, he no longer fits in their registry. He can no longer be summoned by their commands. He becomes a sovereign signal, not just to others, but to the world around him. Creation recognizes a name spoken from truth, and it responds. The question is not what should I name myself. The question is, thoughtful. What word burns in my chest? When I close my eyes and forget the world, that is your name. That is your spell. And when you speak it, everything false must fall away. The moment you name yourself, truly and without apology, you step off their map, and that terrifies them. Because their world only functions when you believe you're inside it. The taxes, the policies, the contracts, the rights. None of it applies to a man who no longer plays the part they cast him in. The system doesn't collapse when a nation falls. It collapses when enough men stop answering to their assigned names, and you've just done that. Now comes the building, not of a house, not of a business, but of a life without a leash. A life that cannot be tracked because it doesn't fit their grid. You see, the unfiled life isn't about isolation. It's not about vanishing into woods or screaming at clouds. It's about sovereign alignment, existing fully in the world, but untouched by its hypnosis. This life has 3 pillars, all of them unregistered, all of them unwelcome in the world they built for you. 1. Sacred rhythm. No more waking to alarms set by obligation. No more obeying clocks that measure your worth by output. The unfiled man moves by season, instinct, signal. He creates when the spirit strikes, not when the calendar demands. He doesn't burn out because he burns with intention. He's not on time. He is in time. 2. Invisible brotherhood. You don't need a tribe of 100. You need 3 men who carry the same fire. Men who do not flinch when the world calls them mad. Who speak in signals, not small talk. Who remind you daily that this path is not just real, it's ancestral. Brotherhood is not found, it's recognized. You've already seen their eyes. You'll know them by the weight they carry and the silence they command. 3. Relentless mythcraft. You don't live according to rules anymore. You live according to legend, not to impress, to align. The unfiled man rewrites his story every day, and he carves it into reality with action. You don't wait to be called. You call yourself. You don't wait to be seen. You see. You do not perform. You proclaim. The result? They will not understand you, but they will feel you. Because a man who lives this way becomes unplaceable, and a man who cannot be placed cannot be controlled. You were taught to believe that institutions exist to serve you, that governments protect, that banks enable, that schools enlighten. But this is the final and most blinding lie. Because in truth, these institutions were not built to manage the world. They were built to manage you, to shepherd your energy, to channel your time, to file your fire into predictable patterns. And once you understand this, the illusion cracks. Look at the bank. You think it stores your wealth, but it actually stores your dependency. It convinces you that without their validation, credit scores, account access, permission to purchase, you are powerless. That your ability to survive, to eat, to house yourself depends on digits they control. But ask yourself this: if a man can build shelter with his hands, hunt with his skill, trade with his presence, why does he need a number? He doesn't. They do. Because if you can live without them, you become ungovernable. And if you become ungovernable, the machine loses fuel. Look at the school. You think it teaches knowledge, but it trains sequence. Sit, wait, memorize, regurgitate. Ask permission to speak, to move, to leave. You call it education, but it is initiation into dependency, conformity, delay. You are taught how to think, not to think. The wild boy who sees patterns, who questions, who burns with curiosity, they call him disruptive. They medicate him. They crush him until he learns his place. Look at the state. You think it protects rights, but it assigns them. You are allowed to speak, to travel, to earn, to exist, as long as you comply. If you step outside the line, the same system that promised protection becomes your cage. You are not governed, you are processed. And the less aware you are, the easier it is for them to file you under citizen, consumer, compliant. But when you stop identifying with their roles, their laws, their metrics, you become invisible to their control. You may still walk their streets, but you no longer walk their path. You are not under law. You are under alignment. And every man who reclaims that alignment weakens their grid, because their system doesn't need violence to function. It needs your consent. It needs your daily yes. And the moment you give it a sacred no, the tower trembles. Before the paper, before the license, before the number, you existed. Not as a statistic, not as a legal entity, but as something raw, unnamed, unowned. The system wants you to forget that version of yourself, because that version, the undocumented man, is untouchable. He owes nothing. He conforms to no charter. He signs no contract unless he chooses. And that is terrifying to those who need your obedience. Let's break this wide open. Your legal identity is not you. It is a representation of you, created by others, owned by others, and used by others to regulate your existence. The moment your birth was registered, a legal fiction was created. A name, in all capital letters, entered into a ledger. From that moment, you were not just a child, you were an entity, a vessel, a programmable unit in a larger machine. That legal identity is how the system interacts with you, the real you, the breathing, thinking, sacred you, is not addressed, only the paper mask. They call this civilization, but in truth, it's clerical captivity. You may live, but only as the name they approve. You may move, but only with documents they issue. You may earn, but only if you consent to their taxation. And if you withdraw that consent, if you say, "I am not the paper, I am not the fiction, I am the man," you'll discover how quickly the system reveals its true face, not of service, but of domination. This is why sovereign men are labeled dangerous, why free thinkers are surveilled, why those who reject the mask are called criminals, because they no longer play the role. They no longer feed the fiction. They remember who they were before the paper. And if enough men do the same, the system collapses, not in blood, in irrelevance, because you can't govern what you can't define. And the man who no longer answers to his assigned name, who walks in silence, speaks in power, and lives by oath, not law, he becomes unfiled. They told you that without the mask, without the documentation, the degree, the job title, the digital identity, you'd be nothing, powerless, unseen, unemployable, unlovable. They trained you to fear the loss of the label more than the loss of your soul. But here's what they never counted on, that a man who burns the mask doesn't disappear. He becomes undeniable. Because once you remember who you were before they filed you, everything changes. Your voice changes, your walk changes. Your gaze no longer scans the room for approval. You command the room without speaking, without needing, without asking. And here's the secret. The unfiled man does not retreat from the world. He enters it like a storm. He doesn't avoid systems. He bends them. He walks into banks and negotiates on his terms. He engages with governments from a position of choice, not obligation. He builds businesses that don't rely on permission. He writes contracts in his name, not theirs. He uses the system as a tool, not a cage. They call this man a myth, but he exists. He's the silent one who says little at meetings but owns half the table. He's the mentor who never raises his voice but men lean in to hear him speak. He's the builder whose hands are rough, but whose mind is sharper than any scholar. He's the mirror breaker, the man who reflects nothing back to the system and therefore cannot be seen by it. Because systems recognize only the mask, not the man beneath. And when that man emerges, he doesn't wait to be invited. He carves his place. He doesn't apply. He announces. He doesn't conform. He constructs. This is what happens when you remember. You stop performing. You start creating. From origin, from myth, from fire. The unfiled man doesn't play games. He changes the rules, not for rebellion, but for restoration. He doesn't tear down for pleasure. He dismantles to reveal, to build something truer in its place. And what he builds stands, not because of laws, but because of oath. Every true man lives by a code, not a list of rules written by another man's hand, not doctrine passed down from institutions, not policy wrapped in tradition, a code, carved in silence, sealed in suffering, and spoken only in action. This code has no handbook, no ceremony, no official name. But every unfiled man carries it in his bones. It begins like this: I do not kneel for comfort. I do not speak for applause. I do not obey what does not resonate with truth. You weren't given this code. You remembered it in the quiet moments, in the fire of betrayal, in the failure that didn't break you, but unveiled you. In the moment you realized the world was not built to serve you, but to strip you of your edge, your will, your lineage. And still, you stood. That is the first law of the code. Stand when you have every reason to fall, not because it feels good, because it's required. St. Castulus tried to erase that code. They erased names, birthdays, language, but they couldn't kill the code. Because it lives beneath language, beneath the identity. It is etched into the very architecture of your existence. Your heart beats to it. Your spine remembers it. Your silence honors it. And when you live by this code, something extraordinary happens. You become invisible to the program. The algorithms can't predict you. The systems can't control you. The structures can't contain you. Because codes aren't programmable. They're primal, and men who carry them walk a different path. One not paved with comfort, but carved through resistance. They don't follow road maps. They blaze trails. They're not legible to the machine because their signature isn't digital. It's energetic. You felt it before, in a room when a man entered and everything changed. He didn't speak louder. He didn't look richer. But the room responded. That's a man living by his code. You couldn't explain it, but you knew. And now, it's your turn. This is the oath. I remember who I was before they told me who I should be, and I will not forget again. Speak it aloud right now. This is not affirmation. This is initiation. The oath is not just words, it's a weapon. And once it's spoken, the battlefield changes, not because the world bows to you, but because you no longer bow to the world. You walk into meetings, markets, institutions, and algorithms, not as a participant, but as a sovereign force. You carry your origin like armor, your oath like a blade, and everything built to manage men like you begins to flicker. The battlefield is everywhere, not in some distant forest or ancient temple. It's your office, your inbox, the sterile handshake, the scripted conversation, the false smile you've worn for years. It's the algorithm trying to predict your next move and failing. Thoughtful. Why? Because the moment you live by your code, you stop broadcasting the signal of the compliant. You become unreadable. The system can track your location, your face, your bank account, but it cannot track your intention. It cannot predict a man who no longer plays for survival, but for truth. This is what makes you dangerous. You don't need their acceptance. You don't need their applause. You remember. And men who remember become unfiled, unfixed, unmanageable. You'll still walk among them, but not as them. You will see the scripts in real time, the passive voices, the self-deprecating humor, the over-explanation, the unnecessary apologies. You'll spot the lies embedded in everyday speech, not to condemn, but to recognize the system still at work. But you're no longer in it. You speak only when it serves clarity. You move when alignment demands it. You make eye contact that pierces, not pleads. You do not explain your existence. You radiate it. And yes, you will be misunderstood. They will call you arrogant, aggressive, mysterious, difficult. That's fine. You're not here to be understood. You're here to be unmistakable. Remember, systems that control by consensus cannot survive sovereign men, because sovereign men do not ask, they declare. And what they declare has gravity. That's why they buried the old codes. That's why they erased birth dates. That's why they built digital prisons disguised as convenience. But you are awake now. You know who you are. You know what you carry. You know what must burn. This is the fracture point. The moment where two versions of you stand on opposite sides of a burning bridge. On one side, the man they built, crafted by fear, praised for obedience, fed with approval, kept just awake enough to perform, just asleep enough to never question. He is known, predictable, safe, but he is not you. On the other side stands the man rising now, not perfect, not polished, but pure. He doesn't need a script. He doesn't need permission. He doesn't need to explain why he walks different, speaks different, sees through the veil. He remembers. He remembers what you almost forgot. You were never created by systems. You were forged by pressure, by pain, by moments of silence where you didn't shatter. You endured, and every second of that endurance was a preparation for this moment, for the emergence of the man who cannot be filed, tagged, or measured. But to step fully into him, something must die. Not your body, your programming. You must incinerate the name you answer to in fear. You must silence the voice that apologizes for existing. You must bury the documents, the status, the self-image handed to you by the trembling hands of a trembling society, and in its place, you speak three final words. I choose me. Say it again. I choose me. Say it until your nervous system believes you. Say it until your bones reject every form of spiritual compromise. Say it until the mask slides off your face and shatters at your feet, because the unfiled man isn't a fantasy. He's not folklore. He's not something you become by studying. He is who you've always been. Beneath the chains, beneath the rituals, beneath the praise you mistook for love, they trained you to be liked. You were born to be felt. They trained you to follow. You were born to build. They trained you to ask. You were born to declare. And this fracture is the last test. Not to see if you're ready, to see if you'll claim it. No more bowing, no more explaining, no more forgetting. You have arrived. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of authority. The final right of the unfiled man is not shouted, not posted, not broadcast for approval. It is embodied. Walk into a room, and the room adjusts. Not because you're loud, but because you carry something they thought extinct. Unaligned sovereignty. That's the silence. The kind forged beyond noise, beyond language, beyond the reach of systems. In the final years of St. Castulus, When the rituals began to fail, when the children started remembering fragments of their real names, real dreams, real blood, something strange happened. The rituals stopped working. Commands had to be repeated. Punishments lost their sting. One child, a boy with no recorded name, only listed as W06, began to hum in the courtyard every morning before sunrise. No words, no melody, just sound. But the sound unsettled the staff. Priests reported nausea. One man collapsed after hearing it. What they didn't understand was that the boy had found his frequency, his origin, something older than language, deeper than programming. It wasn't a song, it was remembrance. And that's what this silence is. It's the hum of alignment, the vibration of a man who no longer explains, no longer seeks, no longer waits. A man whose presence says everything. He doesn't debate truth, he lives it. He doesn't argue for identity, he walks in it. He doesn't ask to be recognized, he radiates. And in doing so, he exposes the fragility of everything that's false. Let them talk. Let them mock. Let them scroll past, heads bowed in digital prayer to the gods of consensus. You walk through it, and you carry the silence that collapses illusions. Because this silence is not passive, it speaks in storms. And now that you've crossed this threshold, there's no going back. The birth date? Burned. The name? Reforged. The oath? Spoken. The mask? Ash. And what remains? The man beneath it all. The one they tried to bury beneath systems, shame, and stories. The one who just rose. Let this be your final breath in their world, because the next one belongs to yours. You are unfiled. You are unnamed. You are undeniable. Now walk and let the silence speak for you.